Unfair treatment by the Indian Army at Saibol Post, a comprehensive overview. The events surrounding the unfair treatment of the Kookie community at the Saibol Post provide a complex and deeply troubling narrative. This issue, rooted in historical tensions, ethnic violence, and the involvement of various state and non-state actors, has escalated in ways that have left many in the Kookie community feeling marginalized and unjustly treated by the Indian Army. The narrative unfolds in a broader socio-political context, reflecting the ongoing conflict between the Kookie and Métis communities, with the intervention of the Indian military at various stages. 1. The attack on Kookie villages by Métis militants, assisted by Métis police. The chain of events leading to the situation at the Saibol Post began with the brutal attacks on Kookie villages by Métis militants. These militants, who had a long-standing historical rivalry with the Kookie people, launched coordinated assaults on Kookie settlements. What made this assault particularly alarming was the reported involvement of the Métis police. The police, a force traditionally entrusted with maintaining law and order, were accused of siding with the militants in these attacks, allowing the violence to escalate unchecked. This collaboration between the militants and the police was not only a breach of trust, but also added a layer of state-sponsored aggression to the violence. The Kookie villages, many of which had been peaceful agricultural settlements for generations, were subjected to indiscriminate attacks. Homes were set on fire, fields were destroyed, and people were killed or displaced. In the face of this violence, the Kookie community took steps to protect themselves and their homes. Responding in self-defense, the Kookie began retaliating, attempting to ward off the militants and defend their villages. This response, however, was seen as a provocation by the Indian Army, which took decisive action in the aftermath. 2. Kookie volunteers burning their belongings and preparing to leave. In the wake of the Métis militant attacks, a sense of desperation began to take hold within the Kookie community. Many Kookie villagers, facing overwhelming threats to their lives and properties, began to take drastic measures. As they saw their homes destroyed and their land desecrated, Kookie volunteers, angered and frustrated by the lack of protection, resorted to burning their own belongings. This was not an act of surrender, but rather one of defiance and despair. They burned their houses, personal effects, and everything they held dear, preparing to leave the area altogether. This act of self-destruction was symbolic on multiple levels. It represented the emotional and psychological toll the violence had inflicted on the Kookie people. It was also an expression of their frustration and a message to the authorities that they could not continue to live under constant threat and fear of annihilation. The volunteers, whose families had lived in these villages for generations, were now contemplating exile in the face of continued violence and state indifference. 3. Unfair treatment of the Kookie community by the Indian Army. At the heart of the unfolding tragedy was the perceived unfair treatment of the Kookie community by the Indian Army. In a move that was both harsh and controversial, the Indian Army dismantled Kookie outposts at Saibol. These outposts, which had been established by the Kookie people to defend themselves against the Métis militants, were suddenly targeted by the Indian military. This action raised many questions about the Army's role in the conflict, as well as its approach to handling the Kookie's self-defense efforts. The dismantling of the Kookie outposts at Saibol was seen by many as a punitive measure against the Kookie community. Instead of protecting the Kookie villages from the militant attacks, the Indian Army appeared to be siding with the Métis community, dismantling the very structures that the Kookie had put in place to safeguard themselves. This was not only a betrayal of the Kookie people's trust, but also an example of how the Army's intervention, rather than resolving the conflict, exacerbated the situation. The Kookie people had hoped for protection under the Indian state, believing that the military would act impartially to quell the violence. However, their expectations were shattered when the Indian Army's actions appeared to favor the Métis militants, leaving the Kookie community vulnerable and exposed. The Kookie volunteers and their families were left to face the consequences of both the militant violence and the Indian Army's actions, which many felt were unjust and disproportionate. In the context of this military intervention, the Kookie people were subjected to what they perceived as discrimination and bias. They argued that their right to self-defense and their very existence as a community were being undermined. The dismantling of their outposts was seen not as an attempt to restore order, but as an additional layer of repression against an already marginalized people. This perceived bias has created a growing sense of injustice among the Kookie community, with many voicing their dissatisfaction and calling for accountability. Conclusion. The situation at Saibol Post reflects a larger pattern of what the Kookie community views as unfair treatment by the Indian Army. The violence perpetrated by Meitei militants, the complicity of the Meitei police, and the subsequent dismantling of Kookie outposts have left many Kookie people feeling abandoned and betrayed. Their homes and livelihoods were destroyed, and their attempts at self-defense were met with military intervention that many saw as unjust. The Kookie community's response, including the burning of their belongings and their readiness to leave, underscores the depth of their frustration and the dire circumstances they faced. The role of the Indian Army in this conflict, particularly its actions at Saibol, has created a significant divide between the Kookie people and the Indian state. Many Kookie individuals now view the Army's involvement as a form of punishment rather than protection. This sense of unfair treatment has fueled feelings of alienation and disillusionment, with the Kookie people calling for justice and accountability. As the situation unfolds, it is clear that the Kookie community's grievances are not just about the immediate violence they have endured, but also about the long-standing marginalization and neglect they have faced from both state and military forces. The events at Saibol Post serve as a stark reminder of the need for impartiality and fairness in the handling of ethnic conflicts and the protection of marginalized communities. Disclaimer: Zelenga Media does not own the article or video used in this content. It is shared under the YouTube Fair Use Policy for educational and informational purposes. To stay informed, make sure to subscribe to Zelenga Media for more updates.